We continue our music studies today by looking at music from the 20th century. This means that we have covered 300 years of music history in just a few short lessons. We began by looking at music from the 1600s, and we've worked all the way now to the year 1900. Our purpose is to identify characteristics of music from the 20th century. Before we begin, let's glance back to the year 1600. We learned that the Baroque era involved music that was fancy, ornamented, and embellished. Then we learned that by 1750, people preferred something much different. They appreciated music that was simple, symmetrical, and balanced. As we move forward in history and arrive at the year 1820 in the Romantic era, music has become very expressive and emotional. The characteristics of the 20th century include music that is inspired and experimental. By inspired, we mean that composers and musicians have 300 years, even more, of music that they can look toward or look back and learn from. So I might, as a composer, write music in the style of Antonio Vivaldi. Or I might, as a musician, imagine how Beethoven would have performed his piano sonata. This is readily available to me at this point as I study my own music and make my own style. Experimental music refers to the developments that came about in the 20th century. We'll look at a couple of those throughout the lesson, but one thing to keep in mind is that there are always new ways to attempt music. And in the 20th century, we see an outpouring of experiments with different types of sounds, with new instruments, and with new ways to enable performances. The timeline for this lesson looks slightly different. We are going to narrow the timeline of development at this point to look just at audio. So how could we listen to music recordings? In 1902, the first mass production of recording was achieved. This meant that records could be stamped, early records could be stamped in large quantities and sold, which led to the emergence of the first musical superstar, Enrico Caruso. In nearly 2 years' time, he became the first celebrity musician. The first jazz recording was made in 1917. Then there were radio broadcasts of shows, stories, things that would entertain people in the evenings in their homes, but also of interviews with musicians and of even performances. Portable sound recording was developed in 1940, which allowed us to record conversations and music in any situation. You wouldn't have to be in a recording studio or in a place dedicated just for that. You could go to the performance at this point. And in 1963, a big development with cassette tapes. The cassette tape is pictured for you in the upper right corner. There's a ribbon on the inside where audio is impressed. And when you place that in a cassette tape player, you can hear the music play back to you. Shortly after, maybe not so short, 17 years is quite a bit of time, the Walkman was developed, a portable cassette player. There's a picture of one in the bottom left corner. The Walkman allowed people to take the cassettes, place them in the device, and then walk around town, go exercise, walk through the mall, all the while you're listening to your music. Then we got fancy in 1983 with the development of the compact disc. And the cassette couldn't hold too much music. Sometimes you had double cassettes just for an album. But a CD could hold many different types of music on one small device. They also helped improve the quality of the sound that we were listening to. Even better, in 1996, the MP3 was developed. This is a computer-generated recording that we would download to an MP3 player like an iPod. And an iPod could store hundreds of songs for us to listen to and scroll through in one place. So rather than having many cassettes or CDs, we'd have the one small device and more advanced headphones as we listen to music. Apple iTunes comes about in 1999, which we now know as Apple Music, and we begin to see streaming music services emerge at this time. So a tremendous amount of musical development in terms of audio recordings available to people at this time. In society, there is more technological and scientific progress than in any previous era. Far too much for us to discuss in one lesson, but we can look at a few important parts of that. In this time, this 100 years, we experienced both World War I and World War II. We experienced the development of nuclear power, which has pluses and minuses in terms of the way people choose to use it. We've also, at this time, achieved space exploration. There's emerging transportation, communication, and computer technology, improved healthcare and education, a reduction in poverty worldwide, and the civil rights movement takes off, and people begin to think in ways of treating others more fairly and more appropriately. All of these things lead to many enormous changes in American life, and so we can actually begin to focus on the country we live in today as we speak about music. The pictures at the bottom of your screen on the left is an early computer. That is the type of computer that sat in my elementary school computer lab when I was in 5th grade. It didn't have fancy colors. It made very little sound. On the screen, we would control a little turtle that was digitized, and we would teach it to make shapes and colors by typing in different codes. We would also play a game called Oregon Trail, and it was exciting to us at the time, but there was only like a green little figure on the screen or a yellow figure. It wasn't colorful like our computers today. In the middle, you see the way that we would store computer data. There's a floppy disk, the red device on the right. That's what I used in college in 1997. That would store my documents. I would have to place it in the computer and then remove it. I could print my documents that way and save them and take them with me. Again, I would need several if I had a lot of information to save. The CD, a data CD, allowed me to store more work in one place. And that's what I used my first couple of years of teaching in around 2002, 2005. Then we arrived at a flash drive. With that device, even more data on a smaller device. Many of these we can still use by plugging into a USB port on our computers. So those developments all happen in a very short amount of time. You can actually see by comparing the computer on the left, the computer on the right, how much computers changed in this time. And they still don't quite look like the computers we're familiar with, but this was an excessively extravagant development at this time. Fashion. If you glance from the left to the right, you can see how women's fashions changed. You can see in the 1940s, women began to wear pants. Menswear was very popular in the 40s. And you can see some really interesting things happening there with clothes in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You'd probably find a picture of your favorite aunt or grandmother wearing something similar. If you looked real hard, maybe my family would help you find pictures of me wearing similar clothes. Moving on to men's fashion, glance from the 1900s at the top through the 40s, and then glance to the second column, and you can see how men's wear changed. From the top hats and the suits that we're familiar with, all the way to the clothing people wore in the 90s. Again, very interesting clothing happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'm not sure why in the 90s we felt like our clothes needed to be so big. Architecture. If we glance again from the top row, left to right, and then to the bottom, you can see as you scan across that the homes begin to look a lot more familiar to us. By the time we look at the picture at the bottom right and then the top right, we can see something similar to our homes today, or maybe even near identical to the homes we live in if they were built 50 to 60 years ago. So a lot more comfortable for us because we've lived in a time where we can recall this, or we can still see its influence. Art. Art changes quite a bit. These three representations are art from the 20th century. You may have seen some of this artwork. And art again, the comic book becomes popular in the 20th century. You can see the type of art, if you're not familiar with it, right there on the left. And in the middle, you see a representation of pop art. In the middle also of this slide, There's pop art representing Marilyn Monroe. This is a Campbell's soup can done in really bright colors, many different ways. And on the right, art that we have not seen done in this style before, where Jackson Pollock did paint splatters, and something just very, very different than what we'd seen before. Perhaps more of a development in his expression of thoughts and ideas, but in an abstract way. By the end of the 20th century, music began to sound like the music you are listening to right now. This song was composed in 1984 for a film. And if we read from the bottom towards the top, you can see that electronic music emerged at the end of the century. Working back a little, there was a need for music for film, television, and video games, because you wanted people engaged the entire time they were being entertained in those capacities. Composers were incredibly creative, whether it was new sounds, new instruments, or new way to use instruments and sounds. Anything they could imagine and produce was available to them in terms of music. Musical inventions, we just mentioned new sounds, but there was also a fusion of modern music styles like the blues and jazz, even gospels and spirituals coming together with music of the orchestra. You can see as well, folk tunes would be used in that same capacity. There were composers that wanted to make a break with the past, so they did what we would call experimental music. If they could imagine it, they could try it. Impressionist composers wanted to leave you with a sense of a feeling or something suggestive, but not so much so that you would be certain what the composer intended. Minimalist composers just intended to use very little in their music. So it might be a phrase that was just repeated over and over and over again, maybe not even with much variation. And serialism became a thing, which is music that uses mathematical equations to produce the sounds that you hear. So I might, as a composer, if there are 12 tones available to me, only use a tone a second time after all of the other tones have been used. So very interesting approaches to music that are much, much more creative, new and different ways to approach writing and performing music. You can see as well, there's always a strong incorporation of music from the past, and the styles of classical music can be imitated in music written even in the 20th century. We would refer to those as neoclassicism or contemporary classical. So a song written today that sounds much like music from the past. Now we're going to move back in time just a few years to learn about the first authentic American composer, Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was born sometime around the year 1867 in Texarkana, Texas. And the reason we don't know the exact year of his birth is that his mother and father were indentured servants, and there were not careful records taken of their children when they were born. He died in 1917 in New York City. He was the first prominent American composer. He was a self-taught musician who learned to play piano in the homes his mother cleaned. So as his mother would clean the home of a wealthy person, she would bring him along and he would play piano. That's how he began to learn on his own. He set the standard for ragtime music. I would imagine that you've heard this song and the one on the slide after more than once. Blended classical music structures with ragtime styles. What Scott Joplin achieved is to take music of an African American influence and merge it with that classical style that we learned in the eras before, which meant that many, many people appreciated his music as something serious, even though he was a person of color at a time when that was not a popular ideal. He held a profound belief in the importance of education. So if he were here, he'd want to remind you to make sure you're submitting your written work and make sure that you're giving your best effort. He paved the way for Black artists to reach American audiences of all races. Many people at this time would not have known that Scott Joplin was a Black man, but everyone appreciated the music that they were hearing, and they would buy his records and his sheet music. So he was able to prove to people that the color of our skin might not match the assumptions we've made about someone. He had very few interests other than music, so he spent much of his time designing music for the piano, attempting to write operas, and in general, just promoting the music of people of color really early on. Another familiar song he has written is The Entertainer. If you think back to the music we heard that Mozart and Beethoven wrote for piano, this is not so different except in its rhythms and the way it makes us feel like we might want to dance, or at least imagine that we were dancing. Another thing Joplin was very successful in doing is creating a sense of classicism when it came to music from African American culture. Whoops. Here's a song from an opera he had written. If you listen closely, you'll hear the use of the banjo. The banjo is a traditionally African American music that at this time would not have been used in an orchestral setting. But he's chosen to feature it in this music. And if you're familiar with gospels and spirituals, you hear that influence in that song as well. Another famous American composer, born a few years after Scott Joplin in 1898, died in 1937, is a man named George Gershwin. His music blended classical familiarity with modern music and jazz styles. He worked with his brother Ira to create many popular songs. George wrote the melodies, Ira wrote the lyrics. He also composed popular songs, musicals, music for films, and works for orchestra. So a very busy musician, very famous musician who ended up being very wealthy from his work. The video you are watching is a video of George Gershwin performing his own music. A little bit more from George Gershwin. This song, An American in Paris, we'll listen to just a brief excerpt. I want you to listen to the sounds of the city. In one of our lessons, we watched an excerpt from August Rush where there was a city soundscape. There is a particular sound imitated in this excerpt. Do you hear the sound of car horns? So in that music, George Gershwin was attempting to collect the sounds of the city, of a very busy city. And it's easy for us to imagine the hustle and bustle of all the people walking on the sidewalks and all of the traffic that's passing on the roads. He also wrote this famous song, Summertime.
And the cotton is high. Oh, your daddy's rich and your ma is good looking. So hush, little baby, don't you cry.
So Summertime from the opera Porgy and Bess, another composition of George Gershwin. To summarize, music of the 20th century can be described as inspired by the past or experimental, leaning toward new sounds. Two famous composers of the 20th century include Scott Joplin and George Gershwin.